Property Committee to order. First item is the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Public comment. Nobody has approached either the clerk or myself relative to comments, so we will move on to the approval of the minutes from the September 27th meeting. What are your wishes? Moved by Supervisor Leahy, seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all is in favor of approval of the minutes will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. And for the record, all members are present today. For the order of today's meeting, without objection, I'd like to move item 5B, the administrator's budget and special projects funding plan, items 1, 2, 3, down to after item 4 or 7B2. So we deal with the presentation of the budget after we deal with the classification study, and then we'll just roll into the discussion. Is there an objection? If not, we will then proceed. The first item is the update on 1611 Chella Street. Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is the property that we had received an offer to purchase on. The offer to purchase was in the amount of $1,000. The committee did direct staff to get an appraisal done of that property. That appraisal is complete. The appraisal came back at $1,000, so you win some, you lose some. But we have listed this property on the county website pursuant to the process that we follow for tax deed properties. It is open for bidding. We do have at least one bid in, and bids are due by the 24th. So at that time, assuming we have at least one bid that's at or above the appraised value, we will execute the sale pursuant to direction from the committee.
Any questions? If not, we will move on to item 7A1, approval of the October claims and question costs that was emailed to you last week. What are your wishes? Moved by Supervisor Hart, seconded by Chair Gibbs. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of approval of the claims and question costs will signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Approval of the tax deed parcel sale to the Village of Aderc. Mike?
Thank you again. This is our notorious street in the Village of Aderc. I have had conversations with the village administrator. I have provided them a copy of the proposed sale agreement, which is in your packet as well. They are going to be taking it before their village board, and assuming that they are in approval of the terms of the sale, I would just be looking for approval from this committee of those terms. The sale is basically recouping the amount of taxes that the county settled and paid to the Village of Aderc during the time period that the property was delinquent on taxes and not taken yet by the county. So it basically gets us back to zero, and that was the direction that the committee gave last time.
So any questions? If not, what are the wishes of the committee? We would need a motion to approve the sales. Moved by Supervisor Leahy, seconded by Chair Gibbs. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of the sale of the tax deed parcel to the Village of Aderc will signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Moving on to 7B1, intergovernmental budget transfers, and there are two sets. One where we will be asked to accept them through ADRC, and the others we will be asked to approve them. Christy.
First one's a set is from ADRC. Now, ADRC, we are the fiscal agent, and they all the employees are Marathon County employees, but they are a separate governmental entity, and their board of directors approves their budget transfers. I request that you accept them, which isn't approving them, because even though that their board has the ability to approve them, my staff has to enter them in the computer, and that just shows a trail for our auditors that we've brought them to our committee prior to having that done. And then the second one is the ones that are county department ones, and I believe those are the sheriff's department ones.
In social services.
And one social services one, and the social services one is the CBG grant that we got that we work in correlation with McDevco and the organization that
North Central
Denny
Community
holds.
Action
Yeah,
Center.
New Cap. So that's the three that you'll have from us. So I would, if you wanted to do those as two different motions, that would be great.
All right, the first item before us will be then the acceptance of the modifications to the ADRC budget. That is acceptance versus approval. What are your wishes? Moved by Supervisor Lemmer. Is there a second? Supervisor Leahy seconds. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of accepting the ADRC Intergovernmental Department transfers will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. Then we'll go on to the remainder of the Sheriff's Department, which are grants, and they're all grant related for the Sheriff's Department and social services. Are there any questions? Chair Gibbs.
I'll make a motion to approve and move to the full board the budget transfers for the Sheriff's Department and the Social Services Department.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Leahy. Is there any discussion? Supervisor Baker has a question.
I have three questions, actually. So, relative to the social services, LMI is low and moderate income, is that correct?
Correct.
So, in the proposal, it says eligible entities or eligible individuals. Can you provide more information on what is eligible? Specifically, I'm asking, is there any criteria in there that limits eligibility by race?
This is a grant that's run by the Social Services Department in conjunction with McDevco and Community Action, and we can get that information to you. I wouldn't have it available right now.
Okay, thank you. And then the final question is, this is for individuals outside the city of Wausau, would acceptance of these grants require any additional federal requirements on the entities, the cities, municipalities where they are?
The city of Wausau is excluded because they're an entitlement community under the Community Development Block Grant. This was a process that we went through as a committee and county board 2 years ago to pursue a grant that dealt with pandemic relief. The McDevco portion was to make loans available to businesses, and the North Central Community Action Program was to deal with people who had housing issues associated that were pandemic related relative to their ability to afford it. There's no reference to race, and the requirements are spelled out in the grantee applications, but this is modifying the budget to reflect where we are today.
If I may, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead.
The proposal before you, the grant has already been accepted. Individuals have been applying, to your specific question, Supervisor Baker, outside the city of Wausau for the reason that Chair Robinson referenced. The grant was limited to outside the city. The transfers are to make the direct payments in accordance with the grant applications that have been received and approved by the Department of Administration through the grant, and I believe it's also reviewed by Decker, which is the Department of, I know the H is housing, but it's DECHR, I believe, through the state of Wisconsin. So it's not the acceptance of the grant, it's actually making the payments, the direct payments in accordance with the grant that was accepted I believe in 2000, my recollection is 2001 was either the application or the receipt of the grant.
Is it therefore a transfer or is it a distribution?
For us, it's just moving, the money was accepted, so it's in deferred revenues because of grant. There's no obligation that's been created until the person applies. So it really is just moving it from deferred revenues into the expenditure categories so that the payments can be sent to the people. If I did it all at once, I think it's $1 million block grant, all $1 million would be sitting there ready to go. So we've created it as a budget transfer to move when an eligible person gets ready to have the money distributed, that's when we're doing these payments.
And if I can add one other piece, that at the Health and Human Services Committee meeting this month, they discussed the fact that with respect to the North Central Community Action Program, subrecipient, the subrecipient to the grant for us, essentially advertising the program and processing individuals through that grant process, it's highly unlikely that they're going to be able to utilize all those funds. So the direction from Health and Human Services was to work to return the balance of those funds to the Department of Administration for reallocation if deemed appropriate.
Kurt or Michael?
And just to clarify, when this resolution goes to the full board, because this is not increasing expenditures or levy, I don't believe this requires a 2/3 majority vote. I think it's a simple majority vote at the full board.
So in light of that, should we break this into two separate motions? One for social services and one for sheriffs, because the sheriffs will require a 2/3 vote.
I think that would make a lot of sense, Chair.
So I would look to the person that made the motion in the second to see if that is acceptable.
Yeah, I accept the change, and we'll have a separate motion on social services then.
So I've heard a division of the question by department, a request for division of the question. So is there an objection to dividing the question to deal with the departments separately? If not, we will divide the question and we will deal with social services first, and it deals with the block grant. And these are, I know that McDevco has committed some of the, I believe that the 207,000 is commitments made through McDevco to businesses, and they are working on trying to identify other businesses for the remainder of that 500,000. So Supervisor Baker, did you have a follow-up question?
Thank you for that answer. The reason for my question was the earlier agriculture loan forgiveness program, which was found to be illegal, and that's why I just wanted to clarify that didn't apply to here. So thank you for clarifying that.
It did not and does not. So any other discussion? If not, the first vote will be on the social services, the distribution of the fund, the transfer. Any further discussion? If not, all those in favor of that will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. The second part of that question, a separate motion, would be the transfers for the Sheriff's Department to reflect the grants that have been provided. Any other discussion? If not, all those in favor of that transfer will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. We will now move on to a resolution to approve and authorize the implementation of the class compensation plan created by Mcgrath Consulting Group, Inc. We had a presentation at our last meeting and talking to Michael and Lance ever so briefly beforehand. I think that the resolution would be strengthened if we could put one more whereas in there to reflect that whereas due to economic conditions, salary in a desire to make Marathon County a competitive workplace, and the fact that we had up to a 17% vacancy rate, the class compensation study was necessary to attract and retain workers. I just put that out for clarification, for context for the public and others as to why we went about doing this, and I think it would help with explanation. But are there any questions relative to the study? And let me point out that at the last meeting, there was a discussion about the fact that it applied to all of our employees, including the administrator. The recommendation for the classification study was to adjust the range for the administrator. That issue, if we accept it, will be taken up by the executive committee tomorrow or at some subsequent meeting, but we would just be accepting the ranges consistent with the findings of the consultant.
Mr. Chair. Just to highlight, in your packet, beginning on page 67, there is the restated compensation schedule that was proposed. I do want to highlight, just to be very transparent, there we do have two modifications that have from the original document in your last packet to the packet that's before you. One is simply a scrivener's issue. A title in section O that is up on the screen right now, the data analyst position is changed to a data officer position based on consultation with the consultant and kind of the scope of duties that we were looking for within that position that as it's proposed, which you'll hear about more in the budget. And the second one is more substantive, and that really is a mistake on my part, quite honestly. A position within county administration had been classified in section O, and the recommendation from the consultant was indeed to have it in section P, and that is the Justice Services Coordinator position. And upon further evaluation, I think that's absolutely an appropriate placement for that position. It will not have an impact on the resolution that you'll consider relative to costing based on the incumbent within the position and their current placement within the existing range. But I simply wanted to make the committee aware of those two modifications.
Any discussion relative to the compensation report? I think we've had it before us on a couple of different occasions, and I think it's in light of what's going on in the real world and our vacancy rates, I think it's important that we be an attractive workplace. Yeah.
Looking at the vacancy rates, they're not out of line compared to what the private sector is experiencing. So it's not like it's an anomaly for the county. I also will state that based on the areas that they were comparing to, Dane County, Rochester, Minnesota, there was, based on what I looked at, the cost of living was higher in about 80% of the locations that they compared us to, and there are about 20% that were lower than our cost.
My understanding is that some of those other communities were chosen based upon a given position. So for instance, the airport manager, in order to get a list of comparables. So all of the communities were not used for all of the comparisons, but rather to give us enough of a database for certain people who are in not necessarily a local, not every county has an airport manager, for instance. And so it was to get that data, that adequate database in which to make a determination of where the market really is for those positions. Anything? All right, well, Chair Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will make a motion to approve the resolution authorizing the implementation of the class comp study that was created by the Mcgrath Consulting Group and make one additional amendment, whereas due to changing economic times and to stay competitive for recruitment due to a 17% vacancy in allocated positions would also be included.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Thank you. Now we will move on to the Shortest item on the agenda, the budget. I'll turn it over to Administrator Leonard and crew.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll do my best to keep it succinct, but I don't think that's going to occur. But if at any point you have questions, please feel free to interrupt. But I want to begin by thanking you for the opportunity, Committee Chair Robinson, Vice Chair Leahy, Board Chair Gibbs, the rest of the members of this committee, as well as all members who are present. It's truly a pleasure to have the opportunity to present this 2023 annual budget and capital financing plan to you today. But it's certainly not something that I can take credit for. As I referenced in my opening letter within the document, it really is a team approach to put this together. So I want to take a moment just to begin by saying thank you to Christy Palmer and her staff, Finance Director Christy Palmer and her staff, Molly Adzik and her staff from Human Resources, all of our department heads and their respective teams and financial professionals, Deputy Administrator Holman, staff within administration that work diligently on our own budget, and of course, the person's hands who probably have, you can see most in this document, and that's Sarah Severson, our communications and engagement strategist. She did a great job of compiling this document, and I think presenting it in a way that is easily understood and helpful. So with that said, as I began, I'm very proud to present this plan to you today. There's two plans. Each year, in my tenure as administrator, I've really looked to our previous budgets and tried to deliver a higher quality, more informative budget at each occasion, and I certainly think we've done that here today. Just for context, last year's budget was 106 pages long. This one is 141 pages long. I know there's cover pages in there, but I really did try to work with staff to provide additional information that provides more context for a lot of the decisions you as board members will have. So in making my presentation here today and speaking with Chair Robinson, I want to take a three-step approach. But again, if at any point you have questions, please let me know. First, I'm going to start with some highlights of the budget before we get into the budget in detail. And when I go through those highlights, I'm really going to try to provide context for what does this look like from the perspective of the average Marathon County taxpayer. Second, I want to talk about the strategy that our team utilized in building the budget, and in making my comments when we get to that section, I'll really adopt a lot of the same framework that's within the budget document itself in my opening letter. We'll begin by talking about investments that we've made in our people, our infrastructure, and opportunities for innovation. But somewhat differently from 2022, I really want to spend additional information, or additional time rather, talking about some of the steps we took to minimize risk, because certainly that's something we've talked about here at this committee. And finally, I want to recap with what I believe to be some of the most evident or pressing policy questions for this body and then the full board through your budget process. So again, if at any point you have questions, provided that's the approach you want to take, Mr. Chair, certainly feel free to reach out, raise your hand. So beginning with the highlights, and I'll try to scroll through the budget document as we do that. Really, the 2023 proposed budget and the capital funding plan is driven by an idea of fiscal sustainability and our aim to reduce the long-term cost of government. So if you begin on page 3 and you read the overview of the budget process and then proceed later, you'll see some context for what our current tax rate is, what the proposed tax rate will be through the proposed budget, and how we compare to Wisconsin and our peers. So on page 4, you'll see that the proposed tax rate through this budget proposal is $4.47 per thousand, which represents a reduction of 8 cents from our 2022 proposed and adopted budget. And that's a 1.76% reduction in rate. Comparing that to our Wisconsin or central Wisconsin peers, you'll see we're 50 cents below the 2022 rates of any of our central Wisconsin neighbors, because that's the most recent data available. And when you look at the 2022 statewide median rate of $4.92, we likewise are significantly below below that rate, 9% below that rate, 45 cents below that median. So I think the message to the Marathon County taxpayer, based on the budget proposal before you today, is that we continue to be a very affordable place to live relative to our neighbors and really across the state of Wisconsin. Another big message to the taxpayer is that, in accordance with direction from this committee and the full board, the budget proposal before you today calls for no new borrowing. Our capital improvement program similarly continues to deliver on the request of the full board and this committee to fund all necessary, truly necessary maintenance and end-of-life projects. I think that's important for the taxpayer to know, because deferred maintenance, as this committee knows all too well, based on our last several years of work, ends up costing more in the long term than fixing what needs to be fixed. The committee just took action relative to the compensation study. The proposed budget implements and funds that compensation system that is proposed. And I'll say this numerous times, the delivery of government service is a people business, and we need to ensure that we retain and recruit top talent to do that. I was down at the Highway Department this morning at 6:45, speaking with them as they do training for their winter maintenance schedule, and that is absolutely evident not only at the Highway Department but at every department we operate, that making sure we have those high-quality, talented, skilled staff is absolutely critical. Another message to the Marathon County taxpayer that I think comes through and will just very clearly in this budget, and we'll talk about it more in detail, is that we've taken numerous steps to minimize risk. As I previously referenced, there's no new debt as a result of this budget proposal. The sales tax estimates are conservative in nature, as I'll talk about more throughout the budget, and we maintain our significant American Rescue Plan Act dollar balance. The budget itself provides for less than 2% of spending of the allocation that we received. So overall, I think, again, the message to the taxpayer is that we've not only delivered a proposal to you for consideration that is fiscally sustainable today, I think it likewise aims to ensure that we are fiscally sustainable moving forward. So the other portion of the budget that, again, everyone has seen before, and I think does a very nice job of laying out what does that average homeowner impact look like. When you scroll to page 10 of the budget proposal as well as page 11, you see what that impact is for the average homeowner, and we'll talk about this more later. But the significant increase in equalized value across the county manifests itself in that average homeowner in the county having an increased home value of nearly $20,000. The tax rate, as I referenced before, decreases by 1.76%. The impact on the overall tax bill based on the significant increase in home value is a $74 increase, which amounts to less than 1%, in fact, less than 0.4% of that average increase in overall property value. I added something based on comments from, I believe, Supervisor Baker indicated that Brown County has a nice method through which it demonstrates their budget, and I did borrow the chart from Brown County in how they demonstrate their kind of impact on homeowner. They, in their presentation I saw from County Executive Streckenbach, they hold home value constant as opposed to the chart I showed you before, which has home values increasing, the average home value increasing over time. So I think this chart is helpful in that it shows really the impact of levy limits over time and how they work to drive down tax rate, and you can see that historically in Marathon County. And if you do hold home values constant over the period of 2011 to 2023, and we use that $150,000 typical home in Marathon County, what you see is not only a substantial drop in tax rate, particularly recently, over recent years, but you also see a corresponding decrease in the overall tax bill. So if you did have a $150,000 home and your home did not increase in value, for a variety of reasons, you would see that decrease in home value. So again, those are the messages that I think when you talk about highlights of the budget and impact on the average Marathon County homeowner, average taxpayer, property taxpayer, those resonate. So having covered those highlights, let's take some time to get into the true details of the budget and go into the strategy that our team utilized in putting the budget together that is before you. And we began very simply with the budget assumptions from this committee. The budget before you delivers on all the assumptions, takes all those into account. It also does an important thing in that, similar to the comments that Chair Robinson made earlier relative to the class compensation study about capturing the environment, the current environment. We tried to do that more in the budget document than we have in the past. And I want to talk just a little bit about what that environment in our assessment looks like. And one of the new sections that is within the budget is, I specifically called out inflation. And if you scroll to, it's mentioned throughout the budget, but in terms of expressed reference, on pages 33 and 34 of the budget, I included not only a narrative explanation, but a chart or a table. And I began the narrative talking about the levy limits and really how they've evolved over time. We think of levy limits certainly as a long-standing thing, and they are relatively long-standing in the state of Wisconsin. But they have evolved. When they initially were put in place, the levy limits, in fact, had a floor. And that floor was set through the biennial budget process, and it ranged initially from 2% to 3.86%. So significantly above net new construction. However, that floor was eliminated in the 2011 to 13 biennial budget. And what you find is that the relationship of net new construction to inflation is that net new construction has been, on average, across the state of Wisconsin, lower than inflation. Now, we in Marathon County have historically benefited from higher than average net new construction values, which I'll talk about in a bit, but certainly over the last at least a year, that has not been the case. I think we all know that as individuals, and certainly you know that based on your service on this committee and your service on the board. So I tried to call out in terms of this table just a few of the areas that are really indicative. They're not unique. I think as Supervisor Marshall referenced, the experience of county government is not unlike the experience that a lot of other entities are going through, but I wanted to call them out to illustrate the overall point. When you look at that asphalt per ton on the kind of the left side, we use, for context, about 84,000 tons of blacktop a year, so that nearly $10 increase over 2 years is $800,000 more we're spending than we did in 2020. With respect to diesel fuel, this is with respect to the highway only, they utilize about 168,000 gallons of diesel fuel annually. So a $1.86 increase from 2020 equates to about a $312,000 increase over 2020 spending. Unleaded fuel, similarly, that $2.18 increase, given that we utilize in the highway department only 43,000 gallons a year, equates to about $94,000. The jail meal contract you see there that is signed by the sheriff's office is up between 2020 and our 2023 budget, $145,000. And then the last column, I provided both natural gas per therm in terms of what we budgeted to have the price of natural gas. And just again, for context, we purchase natural gas not as the average consumer is. We actually purchase off the market, and it has worked out very well for us in that we control our costs. However, we're not immune to price increases. So what you see from 2020 to our 2023 budget, it's up in terms of real dollars, nearly $547,000 from 2020. I already referenced one other great illustration of inflation, and that's equalized value. As I indicated before on page 9 and 10 of the budget, the equalized value for apportionment in Marathon County went up $1.3 billion approximately over the last calendar year. That's more than 11%. So another area where you can see the impact of inflation. I already referenced the impact on average home values, that the average homeowner, their home value increases by nearly $20,000. So you can see that that's the impact of the not only inflation, but also the corresponding impact of levy limits. Again, for context, in terms of the way that levy limits impact the new revenue that comes into the county, I'll talk about this later in the presentation, but it's important to always remember that as set forth in the resolution, the property tax resolution that's within your packet, overall property tax is a component of multiple different levies, one of which is the operating tax levy, of which I will speak most about today. That operating tax levy is limited in what it increases each year, and that is that net new construction increase that, if you attended the Wisconsin Counties Association or if you've been on the board for a while, the term net new construction you've heard. And in terms of net new construction this year for Marathon County, in terms of real dollars, what that means for an increase in new operating tax levy is $856,069. So less than one half of those inflationary increases we've seen since 2020. So in terms of environment, the impact of inflation is one thing we tried to include into the budget, and we tried to control. And I think our staff have done an exceedingly strong job in this budget of controlling their operational costs. The direction we provided to departments was that they needed to cut 2% of their operating budget through the budget building process. They also had direction to fully fund, as we referenced before, that class compensation study. The other piece of kind of overall environment I think that was helpful to us in building the budget in terms of strategy, really looks at how do we maximize the current state of state aids. And in terms of environment, beginning on page 49, you'll see a summary of a couple of important state aids that Marathon County receives. And that's our state shared revenue chart and graph. And you'll see they've been relatively flat. Certainly have not kept pace with inflation. The utility property tax that we receive, the utility revenue, that certainly hasn't kept pace with utility inflation that I referenced before. Similarly, when you look to page 53, you'll see that the transportation aids for Marathon County have, while they've fluctuated somewhat, they certainly have not kept pace with inflation based on where we were in 2014. And we do intend and anticipate to see a reduction in general transportation aids in the coming year. One additional area that we incorporated into this year's budget in terms of environment, and we certainly considered it when we were developing our strategy to build the budget, was providing some information relative to debt. And when I talk about operating levy being just one component of overall tax levy, another component is debt service levy. And if we look to page 19, 18 and 19, we provided some context to the current outstanding county bonds and notes that we do have. And just again, for context, Wisconsin statute provides the bounds by which a county government and any municipal government may engage in borrowing. And that limit is 5% of the total equalized value of the taxable property within the county's jurisdiction. And you'll see I provide you the overall 2022 legal debt limit for Marathon County is $713,157,085. Currently, we will have, as of December 31st of 2022, $104,355,000 of principal only in terms of general obligation debt for which we are responsible. And it's important, again, for context, that we are responsible for some of the debt for Central Wisconsin Airport based on our operating agreement with Portage County that creates the airport, and similarly North Central Healthcare. The facilities that North Central Healthcare operates out of in Marathon County are county-owned. North Central Healthcare is not empowered by the state of Wisconsin to engage in borrowing, so Marathon County has borrowed for those improvements on that campus. I think it's always helpful when I see numbers that large, and they are large numbers, right? It's always helpful to look for context. So the Green Book is an excellent tool, and I know each of you have that, but I tried to include some context in the form of general obligation borrowing, where Marathon County stands based on that Green Book. And you'll see that our general obligation debt per capita is $309, significantly below the average general obligation debt per capita of Wisconsin counties of $459, or the median of $430. So borrowing is certainly something that we need to be cognizant of for a reason I'll talk about in just a moment. But the general message, again, to the Marathon County taxpayer, I think we should all be very proud of how Marathon County has utilized borrowing as a necessary tool based on levy limits, but we've exercised it very responsibly. So why did I include the chart on page 19? I'll talk a little bit about debt service to illustrate that. And debt service levy, as I referenced, is one of the ways that you can pay off previously incurred general obligation debt, but that's not the only way. And when you look at the chart on page 19, you'll see that in 2022, Marathon County had a debt obligation of $1,869,481. If you recall back to your discussions relative to your budget, the 2022 budget and your adopted budget, that debt was serviced not through debt service levy. It was serviced through other revenues, not getting placed on the debt levy. Fast forward to 2023 and the proposed resolution that is within your packet, you'll see that a portion of the overall amount under 2023, when you look at that table, you'll see it's $7,384,561. That is the total obligation that Marathon County has with respect to debt when you include the renovations to the North Central Healthcare campus. Our proposed budget does not put $7,384,561 on debt levy. And I want to just tell you a little bit about how we are servicing our proposed budget plans to service that debt. The proposed resolution does provide for $4,284,562 to be placed on debt levy. So the remainder of that is about $3.1 million of debt service. So, fair question, how is Marathon County servicing that debt? About 2.6 of that is our plan is to utilize sales tax revenues to do that. Again, to limit property tax growth to Marathon County homeowners. The other $500,000 is interest income and other miscellaneous revenues. But again, I think it's a sustainable budget to the Marathon County taxpayer that we're not having all of that debt capacity go to debt service levy. In fact, 42% is being paid in some other fashion. Another environmental condition, I think certainly that has impacted the budget proposal that we've made is one of overall economic outlook. And I referenced this in my cover letter to the board. You know, simply put, I think everyone feels there's more economic uncertainty moving into 2023 or in this budget process than has perhaps been the case in the past. The Federal Reserve has taken action relative to interest rates that certainly makes borrowing more expensive. It's one of the other reasons that certainly there's not new debt being incurred in this budget. It also can impact capital planning based on cost and debt service. But it also can slow economic growth in terms of less spending, which for the counties means less sales tax, also perhaps less property tax revenues. So we as staff didn't lose sight of that in putting this budget together. So that's the environment that we tried to make sure we took into account when we were building the budget. And I want to just take a few minutes to talk about what does that look like then in terms of strategies, in terms of investments. And as I laid out in the budget document, I think we make investments in a number of ways. First and foremost, our people. I cannot say this enough. Our staff are our most important asset. We have a lot of assets. We have the largest infrastructure system in terms of county roads in the state of Wisconsin. We have over 1 million square feet of buildings. People are our greatest asset. And that's why, you know, we put the class compensation study before you. It's been, the last time that was adopted was 2012, so I think it's absolutely critical to move that forward. I know this committee is very well acquainted with that. But the Public Safety Committee, just for context, they recently proposed an amendment to the strategic plan to call upon the county to adopt a strategy that indicates it is necessary to adopt and maintain a compensation schedule that allows us to deliver high-quality services. And I think that's what our staff allow us to do. So I also knew that I couldn't bring a budget before you that says staff are really important and we want you to adopt this compensation model and have you had to make very difficult choices about cutting services. So we challenged staff and they were certainly up to the challenge. We developed a budget proposal, as I referenced before, that funds the compensation plan we are living within our means. So how did we do that? On the staff side, I think we did a couple of things that I want to highlight. We really sought to maximize efficiency, reduce costs, and seek out new revenues. And I'll go through a couple of these very quickly, but you know, I can't say enough about the district attorney's office. They worked with our CCIT staff to develop a new mechanism through which they transfer electronic discovery, equating to a 400% growth in revenue while also being more efficient. Corporation Counsel's office made changes to time tracking to ensure that we're getting timely reimbursements from the state. We made model changes, and these are all referenced within the department updates, but staff take very seriously the obligation we have to be the how people. You as the board and representatives of the board, committees of the board, you are the what people. What services, what programs do you want us to provide to serve the people of the county? It's our obligation. That's heavy work for the county board. It certainly is very important. Staff, we take very seriously our corresponding role to make sure we're doing that in the most efficient, cost-effective way possible. So model changes within the health department. We moved from the Start Right model of home visiting, nurse home visiting, to the nurse-family partnership. We're going to do that in 2023. That in 2023 is going to save $373,000 without a corresponding drop in service. I couldn't be more proud of our staff in the health department for doing that. Moving forward, that's actually going to save even more money because we do have some startup costs with that model change. social services and the sheriff's office worked collaboratively for a number of months on really evaluating how we delivered shelter home services. We're going to change how we do that. We're not going to reopen and directly deliver shelter home services the way we had in the past. We're delivering those services differently through social services and contracting. It's going to save us approximately $200,000. So we're going to serve the needs of those children in each of those systems differently, still delivering based on the board's direction that, you know, the services, what do we need to provide to children will still be there, but we're going to do it more effectively. And lastly, the Juvenile Detention Center. The sheriff's office has worked and public safety has been kept informed of this, but they've worked to really change the way we look at operating that center. We've been closed for a while, and we are really adopting what I think is an innovative approach, making sure that our partners in other counties contract. We enter into annual contracts for those beds. We can't run the juvenile center without those contracts. It's not fiscally sustainable. So we're doing that differently. Another example of that model change. One other important highlight, and this is not something new, it's referenced in previous budgets. It's referenced beginning on page, on the pages talking about adjustments made to the budget. Number one, we are budgeting for attrition in several departments. We are not budgeting for full staff. As Supervisor Marshall said, we live in a world where we need to account for the standard turnover in staff. I want to make very clear that doesn't actually save us money. We are just budgeting tighter, but we're doing that to limit the need to have the board consider borrowing. Now, there are a lot of counties that if you budget for full staffing, you can start to look at borrowing permitted by statute for more capital expenses. And as I'll talk about when we get to the capital plan, we are funding a fair amount of our capital with operating levy. It's very prudent. We all know if you borrow money to get a mortgage on your home, you pay more than just what you borrowed. The same is true for county government. We have bond counsel we need to pay for, and there, of course, there's interest. So we're budgeting more closely. We're budgeting for attrition. A great example of that is our compensation plan. Across the county, the average cost of implementation was 8%, but not every department was equally impacted by that 8%. And we backed out funds from those departments, administration being one, where the implementation was less than 8%, we backed that out of the budget to, again, continue to fund as much capital with those operating levy dollars as possible. I think our department heads are also doing an excellent job of not growing staffing. When you look to the budget, we always include, historically we've always included, and we continued to include an FTE chart. There are a lot of needs within county government, and when I ask through the budget building process, tell me what you need. Departments do a good job of asking for what they need. I received a request for 8.7 total new positions during the annual budget process, or the supplemental process that was implemented by HR Finance and Property relative to ARPA requests. I did not fund 8.7 new positions. We have departments that are doing a great job moving for office sharing, I should say staff sharing. Our veteran service officer has permitted one of her staff to work in a number of departments, including the district attorney's office, doing some work there. The health department, also finance, is that correct? Working in finance. So where we have capacity, staff are doing an excellent job. The clerk's office currently has a vacant position, and Kim is, really looking at that closely. What does she need in terms of filling those positions? Gone are the days when, if they ever existed, but certainly the lore, if it exists, that county government, we just fill positions when they're vacant. That doesn't happen. Corporation counsel's office, and they are not filling an allocated position. So essentially what you see in terms of staff growth, we don't have any. We have one new position that is funded a full-time equivalent position. It's the data officer position I already referenced earlier in the meeting, and I'll talk more about. At the same time, we're not funding the 1.0 FTE position in Corporation Counsel's office. So effectively, our staffing is the same. I will say, in terms of new position requests, I propose to utilize ARPA funding to fund an additional victim witness position within the district attorney's office. The justification is set forth on page 22. I won't belabor the point, but the state of Wisconsin provided 2 additional limited term prosecutors utilizing ARPA funds. I think it makes very good sense to utilize that same funding strategy for the victim witness specialist that would support those 2 prosecutors as we address our backlog from the pandemic of court cases and also support crime victims. It didn't strike me as prudent to wait until those positions are funded. The DA's office has been working very diligently to try to fill those positions that were allocated by the governor. As of right now, my understanding is they're not filled, but I don't think waiting makes sense. I think funding it through this budget process so that our victim witness staff can do that recruitment, onboard that individual, that makes the best sense. It's fair to our staff. It's also fair to crime victims. It's not fair to have crime victims not receive adequate support from that office. So again, I think our strategy has been one of making sure we can retain our current highly skilled staff and not grow the workforce unless absolutely necessary. Another really important strategy, and I credit the board and certainly this committee with aiding in that, relates to healthcare. Our ability to control healthcare costs is absolutely vital when you consider the average increase of healthcare costs across the country, are certainly in that 6 to 9% range. Other local governments, some of my colleagues have shared double-digit renewal prices for their plans. Marathon County's strategy has served us well over the last 2 years. You'll see within the budget beginning on page 25, I provide a bit of history relative to health insurance and how we've engaged a consultant as of late to work closely with us, but also work very closely with our insurer, because we are fully insured through Group Health Trust, and that has worked exceedingly well. And it's important to note that a strong health plan is not just one that is fiscally sustainable, but it's one that helps retain staff. The proposal in this budget is a 0 increase to staff. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're able to do that, but that's really important in terms of recruiting and retaining staff. It also made some positive changes relative to our benefit plan, specifically our pharmacy benefit. But the strategy that we've utilized and that's spelled out on pages 25 and 26 has really been one of utilizing that consultant to make sure we have strong market data. And then we developed a funding strategy whereby we took the 6% that we had budgeted last year, and when through that work with the consultant, we were able to receive a negative 5% rate change. So that's a significant gap between +6 and -5. We took those dollars and we've been creating a health insurance reserve that is available to us should we make a determination in future budgets to move to a self-funded delivery model. So what that means, again, for this year is that the 3.9% increase that we were quoted and worked to with GHT to achieve, that's less than that gap that we're putting into that health insurance reserve. And so we'll continue to grow that reserve. It'll grow more slowly, but there's not any increase currently that would be passed along to staff. So very sound fiscal strategy that we adopted last year that will be continuing if the board adopts the proposed budget. Other investments in terms of infrastructure, this committee with the leadership of Vice Chair Leahy, the direction we got as staff was to develop a plan where we essentially just fix it. Fix the maintenance do the maintenance work that needs to be done, end-of-life work that needs to be done. And our CIP proposal within this budget, the CIP funding plan does that. You'll see, it's the last 2 pages of the document. You'll see that we do have a CIP funding plan with a lot of very riveting projects: building envelope repair, roof replacements, HVAC replacements, parking lot replacements, fire alarm system replacements, and water service upgrades. But that's what capital is. It's not always the most flashy thing, but it's fixing those assets that we need to continue to maintain because we are going to continue to operate them. The other thing that you'll see through this capital funding plan in terms of an infrastructure investment is we continue down the path that the board set of consolidating our footprint. We are relocating in 2023 both the Social Services Department and the Veteran Service Department to the Lakeview Drive campus. That should happen in the middle of the year. We are going to relocate our conference room assets from River Drive to the Lakeview campus. And we're going to continue to design that Lakeview campus to allow for further consolidation. And again, why? Because consolidation is fiscally responsible. The social services relocation, just for context, their current site compared to their future site is less than 70% of the square footage of where the building they currently occupy. So the board, through this funding plan that is before you, and through, again, a credit to the board in the past for having the foresight to move in that direction, you'll have the opportunity in 2023 to figure out what do you want to do with the social services building. And as I reference in my comments within the budget, there are a number of things that you can do when you have that conversation. We can start to talk about what does economic development look like in terms of a divestment, and how can you take those funds from that divestment and address things such as further infrastructure development. But all those things are made available based on the board's action pursuing that consolidated footprint. Also within the funding plan, I made reference to this already, we are blessed to have the largest county roadway infrastructure system in the entire state of Wisconsin by a mile, pardon the pun. We have a lot of highway miles. There are considerable improvements through this CIP funding plan to that system. And we've also been served by a CIP funding plan in past budgets that sought to maintain shovel-ready projects. And you'll see in the narrative portion of the budget where I talk about our paving program that we continue to adopt that strategy. We've been well served. If you care to watch the infrastructure meeting recording from last week, you would have heard Jim Griesbach talk about how successful we were relative to other counties in the state of Wisconsin on leveraging those federal funds. Tens of millions of dollars of projects that we are going to get as a result of that work. So our CIP funding plan continues to adopt that strategy. We're paving 30.2 miles of our roadways within our system. We have a number of bridge and culvert projects, and you'll see from the funding plan, and I'll talk about this more later, but funding for these projects happens in a number of ways. I already referenced tax levy, but it's important to note again, bridge and culvert levy is a function of the bridge and culvert program. That's not a number that I get to change. That's a number that varies year to year based on the needs of that bridge and culvert system. We also have been fortunate to receive grant funding. We've utilized in this year's proposed budget a significant amount of highway fund balance, which we'll talk about later, and of course, vehicle registration fees. Every dollar of vehicle registration fee goes back into maintenance of our highway system. The last piece of infrastructure I want to talk about in terms of investments relates to our IT infrastructure. And I know a number of board members have seen presentations from Wisconsin Counties Association or National Association of Counties. The message I always leave with, it doesn't make me feel warm and fuzzy, but it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. When will your organization not only be the target, but when will you actually have significant victimization by security breach. And even locally, whether you're a small or large business, government or not, we have had local governments that have been significantly impacted by those IT breaches. So we do make significant improvements in our IT infrastructure through the budget. I referenced those in my initial opening comments within the budget document. There's $430,000 approximately in terms of investments for system monitoring to address IT security breach, so capital funding to procure that 24/7 security incident event monitoring. That's on the CIP plan. We also have other investments relative to IT security. And there's, importantly, within the departmental updates, you'll see investments relative to digital evidence systems. And that's both on the CIP plan. It's referenced also within the district attorney's office departmental update. And I'll talk more about that later, but simply put, we have seen dramatic increases in the amount of digital material we are obligated by law to maintain. In terms of terabytes, my recollection is it increased from 6 to, in the span of a number of perhaps a year or 2 years, to 40, well in excess of 40. So we are working on finding new ways to properly maintain that, because it is expensive, but it is our statutory obligation. So we have important IT infrastructure investments that were made through the budget. Lastly, in terms of investments that underlie the strategies that we took in putting the budget before you, the proposed budget before you, I want to highlight just a couple of what I like to refer to, and I referred to previously, as opportunities for innovation. Our replacement of our Kayenta system, Christie's talked about this, Jerry's talked about it. I really can't, as has Molly, I can't emphasize this enough. I think we are all, having just wrapped up at least staff's role in putting this budget before you, we are all ready to move on from Kayenta. Christie has about a 600-page line-by-line budget document that has to be hand modified. We are so looking forward to going to a modern system, and I think that really is an opportunity for us to drive innovation throughout 2023. We're working diligently to meet our implementation deadline, which is no small feat, but that's going to be important. Similarly, the website, and this is really, the ERP is internally facing. I really view the website as an opportunity for innovation that is externally focused. So the guidance that when I began as administrator in 2020, one of the things I heard is that, we really need to improve our online presence and how people access government. And I think it was, again, a great foresight by the board to start to move us in that direction, because nothing could have demonstrated that more clearly than the pandemic, when people stopped coming to see us. And the tool that most people use now to interact with local government is the tool I'm holding up right now, and it's my phone, but it's not they don't call us. They still do that, but this is a tool to interact with us electronically through our website and our other forward-facing mechanisms. So our new website is just that. I've tasked staff with, take the mindset we need to be more Amazon and less Britannica. People should be able to go to our website and find how to procure the services they're looking to procure. So I'm excited to say that we're aiming to go live with that new website in the second quarter of next year. It is provided for in the budget. The funding for that new website service is within the budget. And I think it's important also to know, again, in terms of environment, what is causing us to shift our approach relative to website. We used to have our IT department, CCIT, that was an in-house exercise. Based on our evaluation, we thought, there are experts in the website space. We're better served by taking those limited staff we have. Let's outsource the website. It's more cost effective, and allow our staff to focus on those internal operations that can drive efficiencies and innovation within our system. In terms of economic development innovation, the funding for McDevco for small business development, small business education continues within the budget. That's $40,000. As I referenced in the initial cover letter to the budget submission to the board, I did include $50,000 within our other agency funding for the Extension, Education, Economic Development Committee to continue discussions to utilize those funds as they see fit, as they discuss what I think are two of the most significant challenges facing local governments, not specific to Marathon County or the state of Wisconsin. These are national issues. But those are access or supply, I guess is a better way to say it, supply of child care and supply of housing. These are economic development challenges that I also serve on the chamber board based on the direction of the board. And I hear these two issues talked about at chamber meetings. I hear them at conferences for the Counties Association, the National Association of Counties. These are big issues. And I put $50,000 in the budget for those conversations that have started at that committee. They've also taken place at the Health and Human Services Committee relative to child care. But my sense is those conversations need to continue. The board needs to address what role, if any, it believes it should take in addressing those challenges. Certainly, it's not a responsibility of the board. But Marathon County government, I think, is impacted in two very important ways by each of those. One, as an employer, you're one of the largest employers in the county. You know, we have 850-ish employees, over 700 full-time equivalents. We have staff that when we hire them, we recently hired a young gentleman, first job out of college. He relocated from the state of Pennsylvania, finding housing as a single male moving from another state. That was the first question he asked when he was considering taking this job. Well, what does housing look like? So that's a challenge. Similarly with childcare, we have staff that have to make difficult decisions about whether or not they can continue to work for us or whether they can take a new job. So as an employer, we're certainly impacted, whether it's jail corrections officers, highway workers, social workers, lawyers, all of our positions, these are challenges for staff. The second, and I already alluded to this, is as a local government, we are directly impacted by economic development. Property tax revenue, it's 27% of our overall budget, as you'll see from the presentation. Sales tax revenue, if people can't move here or stay here or continue to work here or have two individuals within a dual parent household working, they're going to buy less, spend less money, less sales tax revenue for county government. So you really are impacted in two ways. So that's why I put that $50,000 in the budget. I recognize that is not enough to solve any of these challenges. At best, it helps you continue the discussions, but I wanted to highlight, I think it's an opportunity for innovation. Similarly, the data officer position that I referenced earlier in terms of new positions within the county. Whether it has been conversations when we've talked about the Start Right model of nurse home visiting, the justice system, child protection system, or conversations I've had with other members of the board, with policymakers, there has always been this desire, this expression of a desire for more data. What does the data show? But collecting, analyzing, and most importantly, gathering insight from data is no small task. And the data officer position, in my mind, is a real opportunity for us to innovate in that space. It's an important investment. My plan, should the board adopt it, and it's spelled out within the new position request section of the budget, is that initially that position would focus on working with the justice system. I think there's a lot of opportunities there. The Criminal Justice Coordinating Council indicated that this position was its highest priority within the justice system, so that's where that position would start. The position would live within administration. It's funded by reallocation of justice system resources as well as some resources within the general administration budget, which Christie will talk about what that means for the administration 5-year average. You'll see changes in budget, but we're doing that with existing resources. So while it starts with the justice system, I don't think it ends there, but it's a multi-year process to really get that forward-facing data presence that I think that's what I've heard from the board, is that this desire to have more useful, insightful data that we can utilize in making decisions, that the board can utilize in making decisions. I just want to be very transparent. I'm not sure that one position is going to get us where we need to go, but it's a step. And it's a step in the right direction. And I've had Deputy Administrator Holman enrolled in the National Association of Counties Leading in Analytics professional development program to kind of get our feet wet and make sure that we're able to start and hit the ground running in 2023. But just for context, Racine County has an entire department, a performance and analytics department. We're starting with one person, if the board approves that proposal. So I've talked about the 2023 budget then in terms of investments in people, infrastructure, and innovation. I want to take just a couple minutes to talk also about risks. I've said this already, but the primary risk that we've tried to incorporate within the budget in terms of steps to mitigate it is that economic uncertainty. I referenced the Fed taking action relative to rates. So what does that look like in terms of the budget proposal? And how did we mitigate risk? In terms of revenue projections, the most clear and evident example of that are those sales tax projections that I referenced before. And specifically, that's on page 16 and page 47 of the budget. Page 16 explains in narrative form the approach that I'm taking, that I'm recommending, that the board take relative to sales tax projections. We have historically utilized forward analytics, that's the analytics arm of the Wisconsin Counties Association, to provide us those future year estimates for sales tax. Their estimate for Marathon County for 2023 is $16,626,376. That was released earlier this year. My budget projects revenues that are 6.8% below that. And I don't think I need to restate my reasons, but simply put, if we don't have those revenues, we best not have the expenses. If we have the revenues and we don't incur the corresponding expenses, we utilize those funds through our CIP fund balance policy to offset the cost of future capital projects. We limit our need to borrow. So I think being fiscally prudent makes fiscally prudent sense to have those conservative estimates. You'll see a graphical representation of this information is on page 47 of the budget. But again, simply put, it is a more conservative approach than perhaps we've taken in the past. We haven't fully budgeted for sales tax in either of the last 2 years, but again, these are 6.8% is the reduction that I'm proposing. We also are looking for new revenue opportunities within all of our departments. I challenged in my budget letter to departments. I said before I wanted them to reduce their operating side of their budget by 2%, and I challenged all of them to look for new revenue opportunities. I mentioned the DA's office and Corporation Counsel already. I'm proposing that several departments work with the board through their standing committees in 2023 to take a look at the fees that we charge. And are those fees appropriate in light of those services and in light of our costs? So Conservation, Planning, and Zoning, the Health Department, Medical Examiner's Office, and Parks, Rec, and Forestry, they are intending to work with their respective committees to address those. Corporation Counsel, I mentioned before, one of the things they did with making sure that we're seeking timely reimbursement. The other thing that Mike and his staff are going to do is that we're going to look to those departments that have external revenue sources that Mike and his team provide legal services for, when we're going to make sure we have agreements whereby we can receive that revenue. We did that with North Central Healthcare. That has worked exceedingly well. So library, Central Wisconsin Airport, the Aging Disability Resource Center, and solid waste, we're going to put in place similar agreements. We're going to work toward putting those in place in 2023. Conversely, on the expense side, I already referenced no new debt. And I think that's really important based not only on what the debt schedule for the future looks like, but I think as this committee has talked about a little bit in the past, and certainly has been a conversation at the North Central Healthcare Board and the North Central Healthcare Executive Committee, in light of the pandemic impact on North Central Healthcare, they are not able to service debt next year. That's why the budget proposal before you has us servicing that debt, but it also makes, we should be fiscally prudent in that let's not plan for them to service all of that debt in future years either. So having no new debt in this budget for capital projects, I think makes very, very good sense. Neither taxpayers nor the board, I understand, are served by a tax rate that fluctuates based on debt service. Stable tax rates are far more advantageous for the board and for taxpayers. Health insurance, I've talked about that before. In terms of revenue controls, our strategy is very sound. Workers' compensation is, it's not a great deal of funds, but I think it's important. It's within the budget. There is a narrative section about workers' compensation. But we engaged, one innovative strategy we took, we engaged through our insurance broker a loss control specialist at no cost. And we did see some decrease in our workers' compensation, but over time, I think everyone recognizes we reduce loss, we reduce our cost of insurance, and that simply is, again, it's a good thing for employees and it's a good thing for your pocketbook. So workers' compensation, we're doing some work there to reduce our costs. Another way that I sought to really control tax rate in submitting this budget to the county board and this committee for consideration relates to the library budget. And it's set forth in my narrative section of the budget. I referenced debt service levy as being one of those components of overall property tax levy, apart from operating levy and bridge and culvert levy. Library is similar to that. The library, the Marathon County Public Library System, is funded through a levy that is outside of the operating tax levy. It's a component of that overall tax levy, so it certainly impacts the overall tax rate, but it is not something that when Christy and her team are working to balance the budget, that's balancing the operating tax levy. Nevertheless, as I said, it does impact overall tax rate. Based on the policy that we worked to implement last year through the budget of targeting a reserve target of $300,000 within library reserves, because again, just for context, the library is unlike a lot of other departments, or unlike all of the other departments in this fact. Once we allocate levy through this budget to the library, it is the library board's determination what to do with those funds. Unlike other departments where I've talked about CIP fund balance in the past, if another department they don't utilize those funds, they essentially roll over, and following the year following the audit, we utilize those rollover funds as a mechanism to fund capital projects. It served us very well. This year you have over it's about $6.2 million worth of capital projects that are funded in that same form and fashion. The library is different. So with support of the board, we implemented that $300,000 target for the library reserve, which that reserve is important. It allows the library to procure complete capital projects or procure small capital expenditures with those funds, as opposed to coming to the county and asking for those. But at the same time, we want to enhance transparency. So I'm going to be working with the library director over over 2023. She's already working on putting together a long-term capital plan. Her and her team have done an exceptionally good job of managing their budget over the last calendar year, so we do project a pretty significant contribution to that existing reserve, about $219,000. So I made a pretty substantial cut in my proposed budget to the library's budget. That cut is $350,000. I'll work with the library director to develop that long-range capital plan, and we'll incorporate that into our capital planning process that you see within your budget, very similar to how we have capital planning for solid waste or CWA, Central Wisconsin Airport. There would be an independent funding source, that reserve account, but we'll try to do that to, again, enhance that transparency of what capital projects are being funded with that reserve. I do fully anticipate, I should say, that $350,000 to make their budget operational, they're going to have to dip into that reserve. I know that in making that proposal, because their budget, I think they had a tight budget before. It's a pretty substantial cut, so it's going to have an operational effect, but they will be able to dip into that reserve, and I believe it's appropriate. They'll be able to live within their means, but they have done a very solid job in that respect. Other pieces that I want to just talk about in terms of controlling expense, I've already mentioned these, but really focusing on model changes in 2023. I've referenced the Health Department, Social Services, and the Sheriff's Office, but we need to continue that work. And then the last expense control mechanism is something we're not spending, and that is, I referenced the American Rescue Plan Act dollars already. We're spending less than 2% of that allocation in this year's budget. It's for the victim witness position, the county share of that position, and you can see that in the chart that's in your budget. But also, I utilized $404,000 approximately to offset those unforeseen costs relative to utilities. Those natural gas costs that I referenced of $390,000, it's a $390,000 increase over last year in terms of natural gas. So those are the two expenditures relative to ARPA. The vast majority of your ARPA funding is maintained intact, which I think is a very sound fiscal strategy to be able to confront that economic uncertainty that kind of looms. Certainly, if you go to the National Association of Counties website, you can see that a lot of counties across the country have deployed a significant amount of their American Rescue Plan Act funds and have done so to essentially offset operational costs. So you still have a fair amount of those funds that you haven't already allocated available. So before we move on to the policy section where I talk about what are some looming policy questions that the board certainly through the budget can take on, I do want to just quickly go through and highlight a couple of disparate issues. I have no doubt that members of the board and members of this committee are interested in kind of a high-level explanation of the chart that's on page 48 in the budget book, and that is the growth of the budget from 2022 to 2023 from just shy of $200 million to $215.67 million. And I'll go through that in just a moment. Then Christy can take the 5-year budget comparisons. I'll give a quick overview of kind of department highlights before she does that, and then we'll wrap up with the capital improvement plan before we talk specific policy questions. But the increase is really due to a number of things. You'll see when Christy gets to the 5-year budget comparisons, there is a substantial increase in the highway department budget. As I referenced before, we are doing a great deal of roadway maintenance in this year's proposed budget. We are proposing to do a great deal of highway maintenance in that proposed budget. You'll see the funding mechanisms within that capital improvement plan. That increase is about $8.6 million within the highway budget. In terms of debt, I referenced this already. There's about $3.75 million of increased overall budget relative to debt service. Central Wisconsin Airport accounts for just shy of $1 million total. A portion of that, about half of that increase, $431,000, is debt service that Central Wisconsin Airport is going to be making. And Central Wisconsin Airport also has about $511,000 of increases in other areas of their budget. Special education, not traditionally viewed as a county department. It's not funded with county tax levy, but their budget is within our overall budget total here of $215 million. That's up by $84,000. Support for other agencies, which Chrissy will talk about when she gets into the 5-year departmental comparisons, is up a little over $500,000, $516,000 approximately. A large component of that, the majority in fact, $528,000, so more than what it's up, is CCIT. So IT expenses are up that $528,000. We had reductions in nonprofits, which is set forth in the budget. That's $62,500. I summarized kind of the history behind that reduction within the document. And then I do include within that funding for support for other agencies. That's where that $50,000 that I referenced for the Extension Education Economic Development Committee to address and continue the discussions relative to childcare and housing, that's where that increase resides as well. And then finally, the ADRC's budget is up $1.34 million overall. Again, no tax levy increase. That's funding that they're receiving for additional programs from the state and federal government and other revenue sources. The tax levy for the ADRC, as spelled out within the budget, really hasn't changed for a great number of years since the agency was formed. So that provides that rationale or explanation for the increases of overall budget and revenue expense. In terms of departmental updates, we tried to provide even more context than we did last year. Those begin in earnest on page 56 in your budget, and I'll just go through those very quickly in terms of what are some things to look forward to in 2023. In terms of administration, take a break?
Yeah, could we take a quick break? I'm seeing some people nod, and I noticed some people have walked out. About a 5-minute break, because I think we'll be here for a while. I know that I would appreciate that. 5-minute break.
Guys are looking at me like, oh, we're done. No.